Have you ever really stopped to think about where a country's laws come from? I mean, beyond the obvious stuff, like politicians debating in a big building. Well, today, we're going to dive into the fascinating and honestly pretty surprising sources of what's called unwritten law. Let's jump right in.
But first, just a quick and important note. This whole explainer is based on some fantastic material put together by Zuramasnam Sainen, who is a senior lecturer at UITM Johor. We're super grateful for her work that lets us dig into this topic.
So back to that big question. When you think of the law, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably a giant, dusty book filled with rules, right? But what if I told you that a huge chunk of a country's legal system isn't actually found in those books at all?
So here's our game plan. We're going to look at where law comes from in general. Then we'll define what unwritten law even means. After that, we'll check out its key pillars: English law, court decisions, and local customs. And we'll wrap it all up by talking about why any of this matters, what we call the living law. All right, first things first, let's get the lay of the land. In a legal system like the one in Malaysia, the law really flows from two main sources. You can kind of picture them as two big rivers that eventually merge into one giant ocean of justice. So on one side, you have written law. This is the stuff we're all familiar with, right? These are the laws passed by official groups like Parliament. They're formally debated, enacted, and published for everyone to see. But then you've got the other stream, unwritten law. It's just as powerful, but it comes from totally different places. And that's going to be our main focus today. Okay, so we know there are these two types of law. Now let's really get into the one that sounds a bit mysterious. What in the world is unwritten law? Because honestly, the name itself can throw you off a bit.
And this is the first thing we've got to clear up. Does unwritten literally mean it's just floating around in the air, passed down by word of mouth? Absolutely not. Actually, most of it is very much written down.
So here's the real distinction, the key takeaway. Unwritten actually just means not codified. And all that means is that these laws weren't passed by Parliament or a state assembly as a formal statute. Their authority comes from other places, which you can find in things like court reports and historical texts. Now, this whole body of unwritten law is held up by four main pillars. You've got English law, judicial decisions, customary law, and Islamic law. So let's take a look at each one. We're going to start with the biggest and probably most complex pillar, and that's English law. Its role in Malaysia is a direct echo of history. You see, English law wasn't created overnight. It grew over hundreds of years from court decisions and local customs in England. Then, during the colonial period, the British brought that system over here to sort out legal disputes. And even after independence, it stuck around because, well, it was already well documented, established, and easy to access.
But, and this is a really critical point, it wasn't just a simple copy-paste situation. There's a super important condition. English law can only be applied if it actually fits the local situation and doesn't go against the customs of the local people. It has to be adapted, not just blindly adopted. For example, an Old English rule about land might not work if local traditions see land as communal.
Now, within English law, there are two main branches. You've got common law, which is basically judge-made law. It's built up over time from the decisions of senior judges. But to keep things fair, you also have something called the law of equity. This was developed to offer fairer solutions when the strict rules of common law would lead to a bad or unjust result. You can think of it as the legal system's fairness check. That whole idea of judge-made law brings us perfectly to our second pillar, judicial decisions. While English common law gave us the historical blueprint, this pillar is all about how that idea works within the local court system right now.
So, judicial decisions are simply the rulings made by judges in local courts. When a higher court in the country makes a ruling on a case, it creates what's called a precedent. That precedent becomes a rule that lower courts have to follow when they face similar cases. It's a system that creates consistency and lets the law evolve with the times.
And that brings us to the pillars that connect law directly to the culture of the people. Our last two sources are all about long-standing traditions and beliefs.
So first we have customary law. These are legal rules that come straight from the traditions that have guided local communities for generations, often dealing with things like family and inheritance. And then there's Islamic law, which is a really important source of law for Muslims in Malaysia. It mostly covers personal and family matters like marriage, divorce, and inheritance, playing a huge role in the everyday lives of a big part of the population. Okay, so we've gone through all four pillars: English law, judicial decisions, customs, and Islamic law. But what's the big picture here? Why is it so important to understand all this? Here's the bottom line. Unwritten law shows us that a country's legal system is so much more than just a rule book written by politicians. It's really a living, breathing thing. It's a fabric that's woven together from threads of history, the wisdom of judges over the years, and the deep-rooted cultural and religious customs of the people. It's what gives a legal system its soul.
And all of this leaves us with a really interesting final thought to chew on. This mix of sources creates a constant balancing act. How does a nation juggle the weight of its ancient customs and its colonial history while also creating modern, written laws that work for everyone in a diverse and changing society? That's the question at the very heart of a living legal system.